Okay, hello everybody. Good evening. Thanks for coming. Welcome to the first event of Kendal Mountain Book Festival, part of Kendal Mountain Festival. I'm Dan Duxbury. I'm going to be taking you through the night, and Richard Askwith will join us on stage in a moment. I've got a few housekeeping things to mention. If you could switch off any phones, that would be great. And in the case of any alarms going off, I think it's just a visual alarm flashing lights. The volunteers will help see us to safety. I need to mention our book partner for the event tonight, which is Cotswold Outdoors, so big thanks to them. They also sponsor the bookshop, which you might have seen in the marquee just out the front, so why not have a little look in there. There will be a book signing and a chance to buy Richard's latest book at the back there at the end of the session. So without further ado, can we welcome on stage, please, Richard Askwith. Great, okay. Well, we're here predominantly to talk about Richard's latest book, which is called The Race Against Time. Some of you might have read it. But I thought I'd ask you first, Richard. It's not the first book you've written. You've written quite a few about running. So which of the other books you've written kind of stay with you? What do those books mean to you?
Okay, well, yeah, I guess I started writing books about 20 years ago. In fact, Feet in the Clouds just coming out for 20 years ago. And that was my first book. And my main aim in that, I thought, was just to write about the amazing world of fell running and some of the amazing characters you get in the world of fell running. And yet somehow sort of my own story slightly sort of snuck into it a bit as well. And I would never have dared to sort of write about my own running or thought anyone would be interested in it if it hadn't had that sort of permission being granted, because I knew I was writing about interesting people and a great and interesting and exciting sport. I mean, I got to the end of writing that, and I thought, right, that's the last time I'm ever going to write a word about my running or me or anything like that. And then I carried on for years, writing about other stuff and being a journalist and writing a few books, and carried on being a runner. And then about 10 years after that, I was getting a bit more sort of middle-aged by then, because Feet in the Clouds was really about what I did when I was young and obsessively keen. I was never a very good fell runner, but I was very keen, and I spent a lot of time trying to sort of achieve my objectives, and all I cared about was how long it took me to get up the mountain or get down the mountain. By the time I was sort of in my 40s and 50s, I was, first of all, it was taking me more time to get up and down the mountain, so it wasn't so motivating. But also I just realized that what I was really getting out of running was much more just sort of enjoying the process of it, of being out in nature, enjoying the moment, and that sort of seemed to make such a difference to my well-being and seemed to be so important to me that it felt important enough to write a book about it. So I then wrote this other book called Running Free, which I subtitled as A Runner's Journey Back to Nature, and it's really just about sort of letting go of our obsession with performance and outcomes and comparing performance and buying all the most expensive kit to make sure we can shave a few hundredths of a second of our time. And I got to the end of that and thought, right, so that really is the last time I'll ever write about myself, because it's so boring and who wants to read about me? And then 2 or 3 years, but again, I carried on running, and carried on running continued to mean a lot to me and to contribute a lot to my life, even though I never was and still aren't any good at it. And then something unexpected happened to me, and that sort of led to things happening that seemed, again, sort of important and fascinating enough to be worth writing a book about. So basically that's why I ended up writing this book, The Race Against Time. And if you think of Feet in the Clouds as a young man's book and Running Free as a middle-aged runner's book, this is running as an old man book, I guess, or an old person. And I'm not that old, coming up to retire. I'd be coming up to retirement age if I had a proper job, but I don't.
Yeah. Feet in the Clouds was a real hit, wasn't it? It was your first book, but I think you were saying it was your most successful book in terms of sales.
And I guess in terms of sales, it probably was. I mean, partly because it's just had 20 years to sell, and it just sort of keeps ticking away as new people discover the world of fell running, and it's quite a good way to find out about the history of fell running.
Yeah, as I remember the book, there wasn't really much written about fell running, certainly not in that style. There was a few statistical books back then. So what kind of gave you the idea did you have a sense that there might be kind of a want for it?
Really, not at all. I think I'd been very into fell running for quite a while, for many years. And I've done all my sort of obsessing with the Bob Graham round and devoting much of my life to fell running. And I always thought, I'd really like to, I found myself sort of writing little bits about it, but then I kept thinking, well, no one's going to be interested in this, I won't do it. And then I just met a publisher who happened to be interested in fell running and said, why don't you write about the whole world of fell running? And that sort of just unlocked it, and I started writing about, Joss Naylor and Billy Bland and Kenny Stewart, and then the whole world and the whole culture of fell running and how, just what an amazing thing it is. And so that's sort of, that's
yeah,
what led to it, really.
Right,
But I remember when that was published, the publisher then said, they were taking the book around shops, and people were saying, about fell running, who wants to read a book about fell running? And in the end, it was really literally only Pete Bland, taking his van round to fell races and sending it out the back of his van at races.
Yeah. I would imagine can we have a hands up? Who's read Feet in the Clouds? And quite a few, I suspect. So I must warn you, I'm a primary school teacher, so the hands up thing comes naturally. I'd like you to join in. Yeah. If you don't, I won't be angry. I'll just be very disappointed. So I actually had a look at the Bob Graham completion statistics. You wrote Feet in the Clouds in 2004, and there was a real kind of increase in completions of the Bob Graham, since people talk about the Feet in the Clouds effect. Do you recognise that?
I think, in some ways I do. I mean, certainly, you come back to the sport these days, and it's changed so amazingly that it's, defies belief. When I was writing Feet in the Clouds, everyone was talking about, the sport's going to die out, and all the race organisers and the pioneers are getting old, and no one's going to replace them because young people want to do other things. And then suddenly, fell running, mountain running, adventure racing, all that sort of stuff, ultra running, has become this huge commercial international industry. And in some ways, it's a sport I don't recognise. I'm sure there's lots of good stuff about it, but it's just not the sport that I fell in love with. But at the same time, you go to most fell races. I was at a little fell race in the Peak District last night, and we were talking about this, and it was just a classic old fell race, just lots of people turning up, go off, all get wet and muddy, come back, have a pint and a pie afterwards. So I think that the sport hasn't lost its character, and so I know some people sort of blame me for everything that's, all the sort of overcrowding on the fells and things like that, but I think lots of things have changed in the last 20 years. The population of Britain has gone up by 8 million, and the internet's been invented, and people use social media and Strava, and people are more mobile and connected. And I'd love to say that I was responsible for all of that, but I really wasn't.
Excellent, great. Okay, we'll move on to your latest book, The Race Against Time. Could you just give the audience a brief synopsis of what it's about?
Yeah, okay, so I guess the origins of The Race Against Time came from me finding in my sort of mid to late 50s that just running was becoming more difficult. And I don't just mean in the sense that, I was getting slower and finishing even further back in races, but the whole thing was just becoming a bit of a slog, and I was getting injured more often, and I was sort of losing my confidence as a runner, and you go out and run, and you get more aches and pains, and it was all to do with just having a weaker, older body. And each time I got injured, it would take longer for the injuries to heal, and then you'd be even less fit and even more injury prone when you came back. And I find myself sort of running on rough ground and thinking, I don't want to do this, I might hurt myself, be careful dear, all that sort of stuff.
Can I just read a little? My favourite chapter of the book is the first chapter where Richard describes a run in the Lake District over the fells and how it's harder than it usually was. Do you want to read a few? No, I'll do it, okay. Maybe the mountain... maybe the mountains had grown. Maybe the Earth's gravitational pull was stronger than before. Or perhaps there was something wrong with my legs. My muscles felt not just weak, but empty. I thought back to all the times I'd powered up this path in the past. The idea of finding it difficult now offended me. So I blocked the discomfort from my mind. Onward and upward, tiredness is for tourists. And that kind of strength of will comes through, doesn't it? So it was the kind of the realization that everything was slowing down a bit.
Everything was slowing down, not just slowing down, but sort of just getting more difficult. And I mean, that was a great day out, actually, that I was describing. It was right after lockdown. It was the first time I'd been on the fells for ages. And, a group of us got together, a reunion of people who were doing loads of fell running 25 years earlier. And a few of us were doing a great chunk of I bet we did the whole Borrowdale route. And I remember, I think I mentioned it at some point in that chapter, doing it and thinking how lucky we are to be able to do this still. And and I was almost 60 by then. And imagine not being able to do that anymore. And that was really the sort of thing, the starting point of the Race Against Time. Imagine not being able to do that anymore. Not just fell running, but any kind of running, or all the things that we used to take for granted when we were younger. And then, as you get into the book, one or two people started reading this book and got in touch with me after I hadn't got very far and said, God, it's pretty miserable, isn't it? Is it going to cheer up a bit? and it does cheer up a bit, because there's lots to be cheerful about. But the beginning point was me just having so many issues with running that it just sort of made me really depressed, and I was on the point of giving up. And one of the reasons is that when running starts to become more difficult for you because of age, because your body is just going downhill and your muscles are going down, you're losing muscle and your tendons aren't working properly and your lungs are losing power and your heart's losing power. Everything is going backwards and just nothing is getting better. And that comes at a stage in life, and there's a whole lot of other sort of midlife woes happening as well. And you're getting towards the end of your working life maybe. People are thinking, oh, he's a bit of a dinosaur, isn't he? Maybe you're not as irresistibly attractive as you used to be. And you said, people talk about, you get to retirement and you start feeling that you're invisible, and you start thinking that, the best of your life is behind you. So that sort of midlife depression, coupled with body, kept letting me down. I remember having a conversation with my sister. I think I was, off injured again, and she said, "Why don't you just, face facts? You're too old to be a runner anymore." And I thought, yeah, maybe she's right. And then that felt such a depressing thought, because running has been such a great gift to me in my life. I think it's never been much good at it, as I say, but just that it brings you so much, not just in terms of physical health, but the whole sort of mental, emotional, psychological well-being, the whole thing of getting out there, being in nature, the friendships you get from it, the challenges, stretching yourself, getting out of your comfort zone. Running gives you so much, and the thought of giving that all up just at a stage of life when actually I needed something to give me a bit of a boost. I mean, you're getting old, running becomes more difficult, but actually that's the stage in life.
I think you've gone off, yeah.
I'll try again. Can you hear that? Yeah. That's a stage in life when you actually need the benefits of running more than ever. So then I thought, well, I'm not going to give up running yet, or I'm going to stop feeling sorry for myself, and I'm going to start seeing if there's anything I can do about it. And really, this is a book about, how I tried to see what there was I can do about it. And I think somewhere I describe it as describes a journey from despair to hope.
Yeah, I definitely recognise that. I mean, the book doesn't pull any punches, like you say. The first few chapters, getting old is a bit shit, and the book kind of goes into great detail about why it can be so bad. I can read out a little bit here. We're talking about older people. The world has taken what it needs from us, and with each passing year, we become less appetizing. You don't even need to pick a question. You already know that you're not the answer. We are buzzkills, desk blockers, impediments to progress, and health burdens waiting to happen. So that's a flavour of the first few chapters.
It picks up after that.
I think if you stop reading it halfway through, you'd be quite depressed, possibly. Maybe not. So you embarked on a bit of a journey of discovery, you would say.
Yeah,
you spoke to lots of people to kind of really explore for the book. Do you want to talk a little bit about that process?
Yeah, okay. So I guess the first, one thing that made a big difference to my morale was just looking out there, finding that there are in fact, anyone who belongs to a fell running club will tell you, there are people who keep running happily and healthily and thriving as runners, not just in their 60s, but all through their 70s and 80s and 90s, and in some cases over 100. I don't know any fell runners over 100, but I have met quite a few runners over 100. And so looking at statistics, I think roughly speaking, there's 2.5 million runners in Britain, in the UK. Roughly half of those are over 40. By the time you get to my age, mid-60s, nearly all of them have given up. You're down to about maybe 200,000, 240,000 people who call themselves regular runners. By the time you get to 75, you're more like 35,000 or so runners. Get to 85 and you're really counting in hundreds. But still, in all those things, most people can't do it. Some people can do it. And when I realised that, first of all, there's a real boost just thinking, well, some people can do it. And secondly, most people can't do it. Some people can do it. That's a definition of a running challenge, isn't it? I mean, no one runs a marathon because you think, this is really easy. Anyone can do this. You think, I'm going to do this race or that hiking challenge or climb that mountain because, maybe it's beyond me, but maybe I just might. And that's what's so healthy about running. Even half the time we set ourselves these challenges and we fall flat on our faces and make complete fools of ourselves. But it's just the process of hoping and dreaming and thinking maybe I could and trying to do that. So that was the first thing, finding that people are out there. And then I started going out and meeting them, and really at all sorts of levels, from people who just tot around park runs in their 80s to proper organised Masters International Athletics Championships, where there are people competing on the track in different 5-year age groups. And the thing that totally took me by surprise was, I assumed activities involving old people's athletics, it's going to be really boring and just lots of old people shuffling around being cautious and grey with their cardigans and their Zimmer frames and stuff like that. But it wasn't like that at all. Old people's running is great. It's like fell running. Fell running isn't just about running on the fells. It's also about the whole atmosphere and the ethos and the people and the community. And old people's running. This is a really exciting discovery. It's fantastic. And you go to, just two extremes. I know a couple of blokes down south who every year they organise a gathering for 80-year-old people over 80 at the park run at Bushy Park, which is where park run started. And I think this year they had 84 octogenarians all running in the same park run. And the atmosphere, it's just impossible to go to an event like that and not feel inspired by it, because people are just so happy to be there. And some of them are amazingly fast. Some of them you think, oh God, they're going to die before they get to the finish. But they do it. But nonetheless, all these people are thinking, this is such fun. They're laughing. They're hugging one another. They're thinking, we're so lucky to be out running still. And likewise, you go to the serious Masters International Championships, and on the track they're really ferociously competitive. It's like watching the Olympics or something like that. But it's like a teenage summer camp or something like that. The rest of the time, it's like one big party, because again, people are just. Everyone knows that you're just one bit of bad luck away from it all coming to an end, and so, which we are. It's true, and so you're grateful for what you've got. And so what I then ended up thinking was, previously I'd just been thinking, there's nothing to look forward anymore. All the good bits of my life are behind me, and the future's just grey and nothing. So then I thought, if I'm going to be old, I want some of that. That's what I want to be. That sort of old person. And that's a real motivation then.
Yeah, excellent. I really enjoyed some of the characters you met. They really come across in the book. Could you just tell us about a few of the characters that really stuck with you?
Oh, that's a tricky one. Some of the old athletes I met are just really impressive, because the times they can do. They're doing almost Olympic level times. You just think, how is it physically possible for someone to have declined so little, or in some cases, especially with the women, it's people who had so much talent but never got a chance to use it until they started running when they were 70 or something like that. But in a way, the ones that stick with me are like the ones who are fun. I remember a Romanian woman who was I think she was 95, and I met her out at the championships in Italy, and she was just she was like some sort of Hollywood grande dame, and she was sort of flouncing around and flirting and laughing and blowing kisses at people, and she was just enjoying being a celebrity. She was just such fun. And there's a guy I met out in Poland who's like the world's oldest competitive sprinter, and he had the world record for being 105, for running 100 metres at 105, and he was 109 when I met him. And I thought I'd go out and see him, we were going to run together, but in fact I got there and he said, right, very honoured you're visiting, here's a bottle of vodka. Right, we're going to drink this, and we just spent all morning drinking vodka instead. But I remember him saying, I'm not going to stop living till I die. And that, that's what it's all about, really. It's not just about running for the sake of running, it's running for the sake of living. And that seems something worth sharing, really, I guess.
Yeah, something you talk about in the book is it's quite normal in modern society for people to have many years of ill health before they pass away. So it's talking about keeping high quality of life till the very end, till something gets you. And that seemed to be like what the theme of the book was, really to fight against that.
Yes,
against the decline and the kind of unhealthiness in later life.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I mean, you can just put that in purely physical terms. I mean, I'm not going to quote statistics, but if you remain a runner all through later life, you massively improve your chances of remaining independent until almost the end of your life. And you've got a choice between the runner's slope, which goes like that, and most people's slopes goes like that. And most sedentary people, or people who are unlucky with their health, have potentially decades of just isolation and inactivity and dependence towards the end of their lives. And old age can be a very, very difficult thing. Being a runner is one of the best choices you can possibly make if you're lucky enough to be able to make that choice. And obviously, a lot of it is down to luck. But if you are lucky enough to be able to make that choice, then I remember one 80-year-old park runner, I think, saying to me, you do get aches and pains and things like that, but that's the price you pay for being 80. But still, it's a wonderful world. If you can get out there and enjoy it, then get out there and enjoy it.
Yeah, you did go into the science of it quite a lot. You met quite a few sciencey people, didn't you?
Yes.
Did you enjoy that side of it?
I did in some ways. I mean, what was interesting was, firstly, that scientists have recently begun to recognise just how much the human body is capable of in old age. And scientists are very interested in masters athletes because what they would say to you is these superhuman ones whose muscles have barely changed at all and whose immune systems are like 30-year-olds and so forth, they're not they're not the exceptions, they're what the older body ought to look like, and everyone else is the exceptions because they have all these sort of lifestyle interferences of inactivity and environmental factors and smoking and bad diet, etc. But if it was just purely age, we would still be capable of doing amazing things, including sort of sprinting really quite amazingly fast and hurdling and running up and down mountains. So I think the main thing that taught me was just it's like when you hear that someone else can run a 4-minute mile or do the Bob Graham round or climb Everest, it doesn't mean that you can do it yourself, but it sort of gives you some sense of what's possible, and that sort of gives you permission to stretch yourself a bit within your own capabilities. And I think it's a bit like that a lot of us have spent we absorb a lot of messages from society which are basically saying, okay, you're sort of, you're a pensioner now, maybe you need to take it easy a bit, I'll take that for you, dear, and you don't look after yourself, be careful. And then you see these sort of, 80-year-olds sprinting and 90-year-olds, and by they get to the end of the 100 metres and they're bent double and they're just like ordinary runners. They're ready to throw up, and sometimes they're lying on the ground and they don't die on the whole. That reminds me, actually, one 90-year-old runner said to me, people always worry that the older runners might die, but that's a problem all the time when you're my age, so you might as well run. But when you see just quite how far the older body can be stretched, then you don't feel so nervous. I don't feel so nervous about, well, maybe I could run my miles just a tiny bit faster, or make a slightly more effort to run a bit faster, or maybe I don't have to be so scared to run up and down this hill, whatever it is.
Yeah, I found some of the records, some of the world's best for older athletes, absolutely remarkable. I wrote down some of the most striking ones here. A 71-year-old completed a Bob Graham round recently, which is amazing. Hands up, anyone done the Bob Graham round? Hey, good. Maybe you were inspired by Feet in the Clouds. Super. 70-year-old men running sub-3-hour marathons, so 6-minute mile pace for 26 miles, which is pretty remarkable. A 63-year-old man who's just about done a 2.5-hour marathon, which is pretty amazing. A 65-year-old male doing 10K in 34.5 minutes. So these are just remarkable times. 90-year-old Australian man ran 1,500 metres in 7.5 minutes at 90. And an 80-year-old Japanese man running 100 metres in 14 seconds, which that is still pretty fast. And then women, a 45-year-old Irish woman completing a marathon in 2:21, which is super fast at 45. 75-year-old woman running 5K in under 23 minutes, which would put you right up there in most park runs. A 52-year-old woman running 400 metres in 57 seconds at 52. 62-year-old running 200 metres in 27 seconds and 100 metres in 13 seconds. That's 62 years old. So that's just, I find that startling, having done a bit of running myself and knowing what that looks like at that age. So that really kind of bucks the trend and some. So, of the elite athletes you met, was there any commonalities, the people that can do this kind of thing?
Well, that was my original mission, was to find out what the commonalities were. I thought, if there's a formula and they're all doing one thing right, then several things right, that's what I want to do. But there aren't really any commonalities. Well, there are a few, but it's very hard to unravel cause and effect. Scientists have studied these elite ones, and they say that they can look at their muscles and show that the quality of muscle fibers is just hasn't declined at all. They look at their immune systems, they look at the length of their telomeres. But what they can't tell you is whether they're great athletes because they've got those qualities, or whether they've got those qualities because of the training they're doing. And then when you start looking at what the athletes are doing, that's when it becomes just totally confusing, because there's I must have met hundreds of different older athletes while writing the book, ranging from sort of sprinters to marathon runners to ultra runners to track runners, road runners, fell runners, park runners, hurdlers, and some of them elite, some of them not. And then of the best ones, you tend to find a fairly even split between those who've been running all their lives, those who did it when they were young, stopped for a bit and started again when they're older, and those who never did it at all and then started when they were older. And all those have produced, amazing world record-setting performances. So it's not who they are. It's not the one thing they do. Well, one thing most of the real record setters have in common is that they do a hell of a lot of training, and I think that's one of the big differences with elite athletes at any age. The reason in my 20s that I couldn't run at Olympic pace was, most of it was that I didn't have any talent. But on top of that, I wasn't training at Olympic levels. If you're in my pathetic attempts to keep fit, maybe I'll do an hour's training a day or something like that. The world record-breaking older athletes, they're doing sort of 3-4 hours training a day. A lot of time because they're retired and they've got the time to do it. And they're doing it really, really seriously. So most of us, if you're trying to keep fit, then it all depends on what you're doing with your work and your family life and your social life and how you're feeling. And maybe I can't be bothered to do that. Maybe I'll do that next week or something like that. But the really serious ones are taking it very seriously and doing exactly the things they need to do every day. So they've got that in common. But what I concluded was really the only thing they all have in common is that physiologically, they're all shadows of the people they used to be. And however good or bad any of these older runners are, they're worse than they were 10 years ago. And they're going to be even worse 10 years from now. And that's very discouraging, just as it is for any of us. You get that decline from age. And yet somehow all these people have decided that they're going to carry on running. They're not going to take aging lying down and just give up and sit and, as one runner put it, they're not going to sit in the linger in the departure lounge, but they're actually going to actively engage in life. And they're going to take all the aches and pains and they've decided they're going to be runners anyway. And that requires a real positivity of mind. And I think that's what I find so magical about it, because that's incredibly inspiring to be around when everyone there has got this positive approach that, yeah, of course we're old, of course, we're all battered, and, even if you're aging very well and you are a great athlete, you still pick up all this wear and tear over your life. By the time you're in your 50s, your 60s, your 70s, how many injuries have you had? How many hours have you spent sitting in cars or at desks or things like that? And we all, our bodies, it's like my old car, covered in a dent that it picked up there and a dent that my daughter gave it there, and this bit's falling off. But it's your car, it's the only one you've got, so that's what you use. And it's the same with our bodies. They get battered and they're not as good as they were, but if they still get about, then go for it. I can't remember what the question was. But
No, you've answered that excellently. So I know you wouldn't ever call yourself an expert, but you've done a lot of research looking into it. What advice would you give someone who's getting into the later years that wants to carry on running and stay fit and healthy and well?
Okay, well, I mean, there are some practical things. So if you are a runner, I think what they say what the scientists say are the two most important things are strength and balance. Because these just decline, and we don't necessarily know they're declining. You're losing muscle. I mean, I can't remember the exact figures. Something like 10% per decade or something like that, just as a result of getting older. That's before you factor in any sort of bad habits or, laziness or anything like that. But if you sort of do resistance training, weight training, whatever, to counter that, then you can keep a lot more muscle, and muscle enables you to run and to do things. And because that's something that most of us don't do naturally, and I've always found any kind of weight training or gym training just unbelievably boring, but it is worth doing.
Age, yeah.
And similarly, your sense of balance deteriorates massively with age. And if you do balance exercises to try and improve that, then again that will greatly reduce your risk of injury from falling over and injury from sprains and everything else. So those are two really good things. Apart from that, mobility, trying to keep the joints mobile, because you can do that, and if then that's naturally going to decline. Give more thought to diet, because again, a lot of us, I think, as runners, I certainly, most of my running life, have just had this what they call the seafood diet. You see food and you eat it, because you're being active and it just all looks after itself. But as you get older, your body gets less good at absorbing nutrients, and unfortunately, you do have to get a bit of thought to that. I mean, I think you actually just have to give a whole lot more conscious thought to the whole process. And to me, that doesn't feel very natural. I'd much rather just do what comes naturally. But I think if you want to carry on doing what comes naturally for the rest of your life, into later life, then unfortunately you do have to start being a bit scientific about it. So it's just worth looking into, thinking about what your needs are. Physio, that's another thing. Most of us have picked up injuries. If you've got weak spot, injuries that have recurred over the years, whatever physio you were given to do for that, do the bloody physio. Do it even when you're not injured, because those are your weak spots. And if you work on not making the weak spots, then again that will help you keep going. And it's a pain. It's like sort of maintaining your home or something like that. You don't want to do it, but it needs to be done. And the one last practical tip I give for older runners actually is practice running fast, because it's the one thing that we all tend to just let slide because we stop thinking about it. We all think older runners are slow, and it's older runners are slow, but one of the main reasons older runners are slow is that they stop trying to run fast. And at any age, if you don't train for running fast, then you don't run fast. And it's amazing what difference it makes actually if you just start forcing yourself to. I certainly have to force myself to do a bit of speed training, theoretically once or twice a week in practice. once or twice a month, maybe. But if you make it can make a huge difference, because suddenly your running is becoming more effective, and you're using more of your running muscles and more of your range of motion, and that all sort of makes you a healthier, more resilient runner.
Yeah, you mentioned you were at a fell race last night, and I know the final chapter of your book, you commit to doing the World Masters vet category 10K race, so maybe you could mention how that went. But how was writing the book, the process of that, affected your own running?
Well, I mean, just with reference to those matters, one thing I found was that at the beginning of this sort of journey from despair to hope, not only had my sort of ability to run gone, and my resilience gone, and my confidence gone, and everything like that, I was also, my confidence had gone so much I didn't really want to race almost. And I'm sure anyone I don't know how many people actually are runners and how many aren't, but I think most runners must have had the experience where you're on the starting line of a race and you look around you and, God, everyone else is looking so fit and strong. You think, oh, God, I don't belong here. Maybe I can just sneak off quietly and no one will notice. And then you start running and you have the race, and in fact, everyone's, you're all just runners, and you finish where you finish, and it's all fine. But there's that feeling of some just not feeling I don't belong here. I'm not a proper runner. And I think a lot of people, as they get older, they experience that more and more. And I mean, the first time I took part in a very low-level formal masters athletics race, despite having been a runner for nearly 40 years. And I remember driving to this place in Wimbledon. I parked the car, and I was about to go to the race, and I thought, oh, God, maybe I'll just turn back again. I don't belong here. And I realised that actually, if you want to thrive as an older runner, one of the first requirements is you've just got to be prepared to make a fool of yourself. And if you do that, that's just so liberating. And the reason I ended up at the World Masters Championships in Finland, which are not, I'm not remotely of a level to be able to do that, but it was part of actually sort of teaching myself that, if you want to enjoy being an older runner, then go ahead and do it. Don't worry about what people think about you. Don't worry if you're going to humiliate yourself. Ultimately, the only choices you face as a runner are, well, die young, or else, don't die young, get older and don't be a runner, or get older and carry on being a runner. I think of those three choices, getting older and carrying on being a runner is the least bad option. And if you're going to do that, then as I say, you've got to get over your fear of humiliating yourself. You've got to get over worrying about, oh, I'm slower than I used to be. I might finish last. I might fall over or whatever.
I've got a quote from the book that fits that perfectly. It says, "So I made a resolution. I will be shameless. I will turn up where and when I feel like it and run as well as I can until I can run no more. And if people don't like it, they can look away."
Yeah.
I might not amount to much as a runner, but I thought, finally understood the most beautiful secret of Masters Athletics. The glory isn't in winning, it's in facing up to the inevitability of ultimate defeat and then doing it anyway.
Yeah.
So that sums up exactly what you're saying.
Yeah,
good. What about the physical nature of the training? I mean, have you incorporated all those things you were just talking about, the stretching, the balance, the strength?
So yes and no. I mean, what I find, just coming back, going from the physical, I think that the real challenge for older runners is and will remain morale, motivation. And if you can crack that, then everything else follows. What I find is when things are going well, then I do start doing all the things I should be doing, and the stretching and the mobility things and the weights and the sprint training. And then it just takes one little setback, just one little sprained ankle or something like that, and suddenly, oh God, it's all over. And I have learned, partly as a result of writing this book, that actually, that's part of the challenge of being an older runner. And the setbacks are going to happen, and fighting back from them is part of what makes being an older runner a challenge. And it's actually something to be proud of, in the same way that you run up a mountain, you run slowly, but it's because there's a bloody mountain there, isn't it? And you should be proud of the fact that you're doing it at all. In the same way, so I have learned not to despair completely, but at the same time, once my morale has sort of gone, then suddenly all the extras become. I think, oh, maybe I'll do that tomorrow. And what's the point of stretching after I run? But then gradually it comes back. I just know I've got to gradually build up back the motivation, and then as soon as I can, start doing the things I ought to be doing as well.
Yeah. It's a bit of a roller coaster.
A bit of a roller coaster, and it always will be. But
have you had much feedback from runners about the book?
I suppose so. Yeah. I've had a surprising number of people actually writing to me. A lot of them saying, I guess the most common thing that people have said has been, I've been doing this for years, and I used to think maybe I'm crazy to be doing this, and so it's just so good to hear that other people are going through this too, and other people are doing it, and I think that's part of the point of writing it. That we're all facing these challenges, and if we can, when we realise it's not just us, that's quite motivating. Some of the responses have been really quite moving, or sort of tragicomic almost. There's one guy wrote to me, and he was 90, and he said, I bought your book the moment it came out, and I was going to read it, but then my wife died, and I was totally not for six. We've been married for 70 years or something like that, and couldn't read anything, couldn't do anything. And I only very recently, this was months later, I only very recently got around to reading a book. And one of the problems about being bereaved is, ever since I've been sleeping really badly, I just, hardly slept at all. I started reading a book, and I slept like a baby. so it's not exactly what an author wants to hear, but I think what he meant, it was sort of it was taking him back into that world where you could be old and you could be mortal, and you knew all these things were happening, but nonetheless there was still a way of hanging on to the positive things of life. And there's another one that was even sadder, and there's this person I'd interviewed for the book, and I said I'd send her a copy of it. And several years had passed since I interviewed her, and she had developed bad Alzheimer's. And when I met her, she was fantastically interesting and alert and totally on the ball. So it was a real shock. But the person who told me this went to visit her, and she appears in the book briefly at one point. So he read out the book with her. And he said she was absolutely radiant. First time in ages, she was smiling. She was so happy. And she said, "You see, I am a person after all." And then she said, "I'm so pleased. I'm going to write to Richard and thank him." And then he went back a few days later, and of course she'd forgotten the whole thing. And they went through the whole conversation again, and she was very happy again. So it's good and bad. But I mentioned that it's just pretty sad. But that thing, I am a person after all. I sort of think, there's an awful lot of old people out there who aren't, not in that state. But you get to a later stage in life, and suddenly your world starts to shrink, and you start. One of the worst things about age is you start losing people, and just at a much bigger rate, and people, they die or they get very ill, and they can't do things they used to do, and your world is shrinking, and then as I said in the sort of depressing chapters, people stop looking at you, and people aren't interested in you, and yet you're still the person you used to be, and what we all want to say is, I am a person after all. And what these old runners, what I love about these old runners is that, they all think they're 21. They're not. And, sometimes you watch people racing, and they can barely get their tracksuit trousers off because they're old and stiff. But still, they're insisting that they are the people they always used to be, because they are the people they always used to be.
Great, that's really life-affirming, that's great. We're going to open it up to questions in a couple of minutes. Can I just ask you if you've got any other book projects on the go at the moment?
I'm never ever going to write about my own running again. I've got one thing that I'm just starting that's it's so obscure I haven't even sort of tried to get a publisher for it. It's about I've written a couple of biographies of dead Czech sports people, one of whom no one had ever heard of, and one of whom was the great Emil Zatopek, who was once the most famous athlete in the world and was a sort of a Joss Naylor of the track back in the mid-20th century. And there's this one other pioneering vegetarian athlete who was an amazingly interesting person, who was also Czech and been dead for a long time, and no one's ever heard of him. And it's so obscure that, as I say, I can't even bring myself to try and persuade anyone to publish it. But at the same time, it's one of those stories that I feel, it's so interesting I've got to write it. And in an odd sort of way, it takes me back to writing Feet in the Clouds, and everyone's saying, he wants to read a book about fell running. It's ridiculous. You can't have a book about fell running. I don't understand what it means. And yet somehow it just felt that that was worth writing. There was something that needed to be written almost. And I don't know, maybe I'll find...
Yeah, it could be a hit, like Feet in the Clouds was.
Who knows? Anyway.
Excellent, fantastic. Thanks for answering those questions. That's great. Right, we can open it up to the audience now. Now this is going to be a bit embarrassing if nobody's got any questions. So have a think. Anybody got anything to ask? Yes.
It's an absolutely fabulous read. Fabulous read.
Oh, thank you.
But I sort of closed the cover of the book in quite a sort of depressed state because I was hanging on right to the end for the formula.
Right.
I was going to follow it, and there was no formula, so I was depressed with it. And then after about a week or two, I was thinking about it again, and I was going to start reading it again and say, maybe he's missed something, and I can find a common denominator for all these old athletes. And then afterwards I thought, well, if there's no formula, the one good thing is in 20 years' time, I'm not going to look in the mirror and think, you didn't follow the formula, mate.
Yeah.
So in actual fact, it became quite joyful after. That thought was a joyful thought after quite a depressing kind of week or two.
That's good, yeah. I think the formula, it's like, people sometimes ask, what's the formula for a long marriage? And the answer is don't get divorced, and that's all there is to it. Yeah, the formula for being a lifelong runner is don't stop running, and that's or start running again if you have stopped, and if you stop again, then start again, and really that's what it comes down to. So yeah, you don't have to worry about having missed the key point.
Just keep going.
Keep going, yeah.
Going, yeah. Anybody else got any questions? Yes.
I come from a very similar background to Richard. I've got a few more years left. Unfortunately, my consultant said to me, I have typical runner's knees, and this means that I cannot run now, unfortunately. However, I've moved on into two other things. One is I now cycle a bit. But secondly, and more importantly, I keep in touch with running. I'm a life member of my running club in Newcastle. And on Sunday last week, we had our memorial race where I acted as a volunteer. For that, and the thanks that you get for runners is great. At the other extreme, I'm lucky that I live in France a lot of the time. And then I've acted as a mentor for some of the longest trail races actually in the world, UTMB for example.
Yeah.
And it's amazing actually, I sort of help the people with their bikes and stuff. And I can relate to the runners. I speak English, like many of the runners. The French people don't speak a lot of English. And I can sort of talk to them and look them in the eye. How did you get on? Did you get round? Great. I know the route of the UTMB, on foot, walking. So I know what we've been through. And if they've done it, great. I can say how wonderful. My daughter has followed me at the moment. She's in the form. She's just finished the marathon trail race in about 5 or 6 days. So coming back to my initial point, or my main point is, if you can't run, get involved as a volunteer.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. I mean, do what you can, and clearly, sometimes you can't run, but you can be involved. I'm just one other thing to say about knees, because so many people say, you mustn't run, that must be bad for your knees. Runners are 7 times less likely to need knee replacements than non-runners. So, and there was a recent paper, in fact, a review paper published a couple of years ago that concluded not only is running not bad for your knees, it is actually good for your knees. So, I mean, nonetheless, obviously sometimes your knees do prevent you from running, or other bits stop you from running. But generally, the idea that running is bad for your knees is a myth. But also, I totally agree. If you can't run, get involved, because every race needs marshals and needs its volunteers, and without them, none of us would have anything to do.
Yeah, excellent. Any more? Yes?
I like what you said about not worrying about coming last or making a fool of yourself or, kind of freeing yourself up. And I wondered if that has transferred in your life to other aspects of your life, that kind of philosophy.
Oh, I think definitely. I'm not in a dramatic way, but I think there's a huge connection between the way that running requires us to take ourselves out of our comfort zone. I think one of the many ways in which running is just such a great source of well-being is it gets us in the habit of putting ourselves outside our comfort zone and trying things that might go badly. And every time I stand up on stage and give a talk or something like that, I get exactly the same feeling I get, when you're at the beginning of a race and you're looking around and thinking, oh God, do I have to do this? And if, whenever you find yourself asking, do I really have to do this? The answer is almost invariably, no, you don't really have to do this. You can just back out. But where's the fun in that? You never feel glad that you backed out. You always feel glad that you had to go, even if it didn't go according to plan. And I think one of the most key moments in the book for me was at one point, relatively early, going to a Masters Athletics Championship, and I had a slightly dodgy hamstring or something like that, so I was just sitting on the sidelines. And I was watching all these old people, some of them limping, some of them coming back from major surgery, some of them doing all this stuff, and I was just sitting watching, and I was talking to an old guy who was, had the same injury as me, and he was 80-something, and he was about to compete in the 800 meters, and I said I wasn't racing, and he said, why aren't you racing? I said, well, I'm injured, and he said, well, yeah. And I suddenly thought, I don't want to be just sitting there watching other people doing stuff. I want to, whatever it is, I want to be one of the people having a go. Ultimately, we all, it's so easy just to think, they're proper runners. It's okay for them to do it, but it's not okay for little useless me to do it. But, we're all just people, and if you decide I'm going to be one of the people who give it a go, then be one of those people, and I think that's the best way to live.
It's easy to find reasons not to do something.
Yeah, exactly.
The older you get, you don't have to look too hard for those reasons.
Yeah.
Excellent. Any more questions? Yes.
My friends and I have definitely experienced the beating the clouds effect over the years. So thank you. But I think you talked quite a lot about sort of fear of failure, but in order to fail, you've actually got to do something in the first place. And I wonder if you comment on just finding the challenges that you obviously continue to do in later life. Like actually finding the challenge to go, what challenges can we do, and do we kind of find that hard to look for those as we get older?
I think the more you start to think, the more you start to not trust your body and to think my body might let me down, then I guess that's going to make you more reluctant to put yourselves in positions where you're suddenly going to have to dig really, really deep to complete the challenge. But I think it's really important to keep setting ourselves challenges, because it's just so life-enhancing having that goal, even if you don't achieve it.
You use the metaphor of like a romantic relationship in the book, I think, don't you? There has to be a spark, an initial attraction when you're choosing a challenger, because it could be with you for quite a long time,
Yeah, I think that's exactly the case, actually. So, sometimes, and, so Feet in the Clouds was partly about my attempts to do the Bob Graham round, which sort of, I had to live with for years and years and years. It was very much, I think in my relationship with my wife, it was me, her, and the Bob Graham round, which made it a bit crowded. But, and I think if you set yourself any sort of running challenge or any other challenge, and your heart isn't really in it, then, you're going to be with it for an awful long time. Maybe you want to choose a different one. And, I mean, in the book, I talked about the fact that, I think there's actually nothing better than doing spending hours and hours running through the mountains, doing long distances, doing sort of ultra distance challenges. But at the same time, I didn't feel I quite had my heart in it to do another major one that was really, really going to stretch me. And so that's why I ended up, through a rather tortuous process, trying to just run a fast time at a proper athletics championships, which I won't tell you how that ended, but it's just, whatever works for you. And I think the important thing is just to keep choosing the challenges and not be shy of biting off slightly more than you can chew. So it's much better just to, if you're, whatever it is, I don't know what the rest of it.
Yeah, great. Any more? Yeah, hello, yeah.
So two 29-year-olds who ran a 16-minute 5K. It was the 70 to 74-year-olds who ran a 23-minute 5K.
Mm-hmm.
But my actual question was, you mentioned earlier that the numbers of older athletes, and I'm 55 now, I remember, when my parents were in their 40s, it was like,
Yeah.
sofa,
Yeah.
not do anything. And I would
Yeah.
imagine that would be true for many of the people that you've interviewed.
Yeah.
Are you seeing an increase in the number of older athletes as we all age? Do you think in 20 years' time we'll see double the number of 80-year-old or 60-year-old runners that we do now?
Well, I think so. I think we probably will, given that there are more runners and people are living longer, or they were living longer, and people are healthier. And why would anyone want to give up running? So, yeah, I guess in 20 years' time, people will be. Well, my plan is in 20 years' time, people will be complaining about the race against time effect, and there's too many 90-year-olds out there crowding out the race, crowding out the fells. But that might not happen, but I would expect, it seems, there are so many runners, running gives you so much, why would anyone want to give it up? And so I think the more people start thinking about wanting to keep going, the more, I think masters athletics and, old people's athletics generally will grow. And I think it has been growing as well. I mean, I've talked to older runners who have been, involved in masters, people involved in organising masters athletics especially, who are saying, 20, 30 years ago, you'd be running as a 40-year-old and people would say, oh, well done, Grandad, and things like that, and would laugh at you. And now it's simply not, you go to any race, and, I go to any race as a M60 or whatever I am. I know I'm not going to be anyone. There are going to be a whole lot of people who are as old as me, older than me. And, I think there are already more than there used to be. And I expect and I hope that there will be many more than there are now.
Yeah, great answer. Good. Any more? Yes, lady there.
When you were researching and interviewing, did any themes arise from the women that you talked to about the particular challenges that they faced as older runners?
Well, I think there obviously are challenges to do with sort of menopause especially and osteoporosis as well that arise. I sort of felt that it wasn't my place to go into that too much because it's not something I'm experiencing. The other thing I really noticed with a lot of women, a lot of the best women, was how many of the best older women were new to the sport because they hadn't had the opportunities in life that any man with the slightest interest in sport, my generation, would have had opportunities to show if they had any talent or not. And if you didn't, then you probably still did the sport anyway. And so many women who sometimes had Olympic level talent, but just never got the chance to use it. And then suddenly they reached retirement or widowhood or whatever it is, and they think, well, maybe I'll try and do it for myself. And it turns out that they're fantastically good. I know that doesn't directly answer your question, but I think the main extra challenge for considerably older women is bone health. But running is very good for your bones. So generally speaking, sprinting is extra especially good for your bones. Running fast is good for your bones. Hopping, jumping, hurdling is good for your bones. But at the same time, if you look at participation in hurdling, where there's a lot of scope for accidents, women tend to stop doing it earlier than men because you get to a point where the consequences of injury are just to outweigh any possible benefits, which is a limiting factor for all of us at different things. But I'm sure there are and will be older women runners who could tell you far more about that and give you a much better answer than me.
Excellent. We've probably got time for one more question, if there's anyone. Yes?
How do you see the comparison between bell running and running on the flat? Because on the one hand, bell running has an older demographic to start with, I would say. But on the other hand, as you've alluded to with hurdling, the consequences of the tumble and the likelihood of the tumble are all the greater on the felt compared with running on the park. I wonder how you see that balance of those two factors.
Well, I think in practice, a lot of it depends on availability. If I lived up here, I would run on the fells every day, and I know that the consequences of injury, you have to run more carefully. But at the same time, fell running is very good for you. And I spoke to one of the top scientists of this of all, says that he thinks the best, running down steep hills is one of the best things you could possibly do in terms of sending really strong signals back to your muscles and your nerves and your bones. And if you're doing that sort of controlled running downhill where it's almost sort of plyometric and you're springing off as you land, it's hard to think of anything better you could do. And the other great thing about fell running is, people keep doing it because it's interesting and it's enjoyable and it's varied and you've got all the joys of nature, etc. There's so much that makes fell running the ideal sport for older people. And the one drawback is that risk that you'll break your leg or fall off a cliff, and so you just have to balance it. And I think really for runners, the most important thing, if you enjoy it, if you want to do it, do it. Whatever floats your boat.
Great, thank you. We're sadly out of time. That was really, really good. Richard will be around at the end. I think books are on sale, and I think on the table over there. Or is it upstairs you're signing them?
I've no idea. I think I saw some over on the table.
Yeah.
There, I think. Yeah.
At the back, just there. So the final thing to say is thank you very much, Richard Askwith.
Thank you for coming.